Today I'd like to try to be a bit more practical than I have been recently and talk about how we actually work with seeing things in terms of the imposter or seeing things in terms of the cuckoo self. So to talk about radically changing our viewpoint and seeing the everyday self as an imposter, i.e. someone who isn't us but pretends to be and gets us to believe what they're pretending, aided by a planet-wide collusion. So that's a radical way of changing our way of looking at things, and that's fair enough. But then what do we do with that? How do we practically work with it? And that, of course, is what we would really want to know about if we were taking this paradigm change on board. If we weren't taking the paradigm shift on board, then that would be fine. You wouldn't want to know any more about it at all. But if we were, to some degree, taking this particular change of viewpoint on board. So the first thing that we could say is that to spot the cuckoo self, the interloper, for being the interloper, for being the cuckoo self, is one thing. But that naturally moves on to taking against the interloper, reacting against the interloper, fighting against the interloper, etc., etc. All of these words, trying to overcome, trying to overthrow or defeat the interloper. And that sounds great, because then we can get all gung-ho about it and just gird our loins and get into the fray and sort that old interloper out, show him what's what, etc., etc. Now, of course, just from the mere fact that I'm talking about it like this, obviously shows that I'm obviously not going to think of that or tell people that that's a great way to go about things, because it isn't. It's a disaster. In fact, it's more than a disaster. That is the very mechanism of the interloper to provoke us to fight against the interloper. So the mechanism of the false sense of identity that we don't know to be false. So the first mechanism is for the false interloper, for the interloper to get us to go along with believing that that's who we are. Obviously, that's the first mechanism, and that works great. But then if we do see that the interloper is the interloper and we fight against it, try and overcome it, that's the interloper's second mechanism, because that makes the interloper stronger as well. So if we go along with it, that makes it stronger, and if we fight against it, that makes it stronger too. So that's pretty difficult to get out of that one. That's a pretty neat setup from the point of view of the false self. It's a very neat setup. You'd be hard pressed to think of anything neater, really. I can't remember exactly what Philip K. Dick said, but he said something like, to fight against the system is to be infected by the system. Or maybe he said something like, to fight against the system is to become the system. Something like that. I'll have to look it up. And that we can relate that to what Jung says about what we resist. What we resist persists. Clearly, it's the same basic idea. So here we have an enemy in inverted commas, because if we start using that word too carelessly, we're in trouble. But here we have an enemy that thrives upon us, looking upon it as an enemy and fighting against it. So and that isn't such a strange idea, of course, because if you have a squabble or a fight, a quarrel with somebody, our reaction is to think, well, if I can say nastier things than they do and more hurtful things, things they really kind of do, stick them where it hurts, find their soft spot, and then, stick them with a pin right there. So our natural reflex approach is to think, if I can say nastier things, more hurtful things than they can, that's to my advantage. I'll win. But that's not how we resolve an argument or calm it down. That's how we create an argument. So the more hurtful I am, and the more powerful and inflammatory the argument becomes, it becomes a greater thing. It takes off, it lives, it thrives on my negativity. And yet here's me trying to up the ante the whole time and say more and more hurtful things. But all that does is reflect that degree of intensity and willingness to say hurtful things back at me. So it doesn't matter how much I fight, how resourceful I am in thinking of really mean things to say, that ain't gonna do anything apart from make the argument even more toxic. And because it's more toxic, it's going to come back at me as well. I'm not going to get away from that. And we all know that about arguments. We all know that arguing isn't a cure for arguments. Arguing back isn't a cure for arguments. Just as we know that taking more and more heroin, if we happen to be a heroin addict, isn't a cure for heroin addiction. No surprises there. But even though we can be aware of that principle, the principle of making the thing worse by trying to fix it, I suppose we could say, even though we're aware of that principle, we don't apply it in a psychological sense when we're dealing with ourselves so much, because we are arguing with ourselves. If I see an aspect of myself, even though obviously the ego construct, if we were going to be strict about it, isn't strictly speaking who I am, but it might as well be because I've identified with it. So if I argue with myself or take against myself or dislike myself, look down on myself, hate myself, all of these ways are ways of fighting. So fighting doesn't necessarily mean attacking and trying to destroy. It could just mean attitude. I'm fighting with my attitude. I've got a recriminatory attitude. If I hate myself, that makes the situation worse, because that part of me which I hate doesn't go away because I hate it, and that feeling, that bad feeling, the rotten feeling, doesn't get better because I hate myself. It gets worse, and that makes me hate myself more because I'm hating myself for the rotten way I'm feeling because of the whole situation. So all of our manifestations, whether I'm evaluating this aspect of myself in a negative way, condemning it, judging it, saying it's a bad thing, saying it's a problem that needs to be fixed, anything like that, that all comes under the banner of resistance. It comes under the banner of fighting, and that all is fuel for the thing that I'm trying to fight against. So obviously that's a kind of a big thing to understand. It's an insight that we definitely have to have, because if we don't have it, we're going to carry on making things worse by our attempts to make them better. So if I have the insight and to see that what I am in my life, what I've become in my life, is something that is actually not something I'm proud of, or something I'm actually find abhorrent or not so good, or something I feel pretty wretched about because I can see it's not really going to go anywhere and it's not a very nice thing. So straight away the challenge is not to have all this judgmentalism going on, which is hard because we live via our self-judgmentalism, our judgment upon ourselves. The idea of being any old way, whatever way we are, not judging ourselves for it, seems to be a very bad idea, because that goes against the basic idea of purposeful morality, being good and not bad. We have to fight against ourselves, just as traditional religion exhorts us to fight against Satan, which is another way of saying the same thing, really. All this comes down to fighting Satan, and kind of bringing in this old fighting against Satan thing. I didn't really intend to do that, but it does come down to fighting Satan. So orthodox conventional religion will say, great, stick it to him, stick it to that Satan fella, fight him with everything you've got and never stop fighting him. Fight him from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep, and keep on fighting him. That'll teach him. And that's our attitude. That's beaten into us. That's a cultural attitude, whether we believe in God and the devil or not. That's the kind of fundamental paradigm for everything. So that just shows how stupid we are, doesn't it? Because that is exactly what Satan wants. Satan isn't frightened by us fighting him. Oh no, says Satan. You're fighting me. I'm losing my power. Oh dear. That's not really what Satan says. Satan is delighted. The more we fight Satan, the better it is. He's just loving it. He's just saying, bring it on, you muppet. because we're doing the really stupid thing. We're feeding Satan. Feed Satan, make him stronger. And so we've got this situation where we've got these apparently wise, knowledgeable religious types telling us to make Satan better, stronger, and they're saying this seriously from the pulpit, and they're telling people to do, this is ignorance on a fantastic scale, on a cosmic scale. Anyway, so from all of this, the one thing we mustn't do is fight Satan. But neither of us must we worship Satan and elect to be on Team Satan, because obviously that's not a good idea either. Obviously it's not. I want to be on Team Satan because Satan's going to win, because he's smarter than all the dummies. He's going to win, so I'm going to be on Satan's side. Count me in. That's not good either. Obviously that's not good. I don't even need to spend much time saying that that's not good, because we all know that isn't good. But neither is fighting. So here we are back in this predicament again. What do we do? Can't agree and go along with it and say, yay, Satan's great, and I can't say Satan's a bastard. What do I do? So this may not sound very practical, but it is, because it's the actual nub of all, whatever we're calling this, working consciously with difficult situations, is all about neither going along with it nor fighting against it, neither agreeing with this point of view or disagreeing with it. And what it is actually just noticing or seeing what it is clearly. And the hell with this nonsense that we always come out with. It shouldn't be like that. Oh no, that's bad. Our evaluations, we have this ridiculous, super ridiculous, super absurd idea about how things should be, and then we spend all of our time saying, but it's not like how I thought it should be, therefore it's bad, therefore it's a problem. It doesn't matter how we think things should be, because everything we think things should be is horseshit anyway, because we don't know. There is no should. Things are what they are. So what we do is we see how they are. That's the intelligent thing to do, rather than getting into a tizzy because we kind of somehow in our dumb way imagine that they shouldn't have been like that. How we ever came up with this notion that they shouldn't have been like that, I don't know. We don't know either. It's just a kind of a thing we have in us that we thought, oh, that shouldn't be like that. People shouldn't be like that. Expectations based on, we don't even know what those expectations, mental laziness or lack of awareness, I suppose we could say. We just always thought things should be like this, but we never really questioned why we would have thought that. So getting away from all of that, we just notice how things are. That's the interesting thing, and that's what counts really, not our comments on whether we like it or don't like it, whether we approve or don't approve. No, what the hell's that got to do with anything? It's kind of like just overvaluing the ego, really. It doesn't matter what the ego thinks, what the self-construct thinks. And I think it's a Sufi kind of approach, because I kind of seen this quote recently, and it's about the higher self and the lower self. So it's saying if the higher self doesn't see the lower self, then the lower self will conceal the higher self, cover it over, draw a veil over it. And so then it's as if there is no higher self. Higher self? What's a higher self? There's no higher self here. There's only no one here but us chickens. Sorry. So that the whole notion of a higher self is something we don't know about and can never know about, and the very idea becomes impossible for us to actually relate to. So that's what happens when the higher self doesn't see the lower self. Then obviously that's the ideal situation for the lower self, because the lower self isn't the lower self. Then it's just, it's the only way things could be. So then the other, what that leads on to is that when the higher self is cognizant, aware of the lower self being there, it's like, there's the lower self. You don't have to go and beat him up. You don't have to you don't have to go and give him a right good kicking. Don't have to call him names. Don't have to be all kind of judgmental. Oh, it's terrible. Did you see that lower self? Did you see what he did? Did you listen to him? None of that. Just to see him. That's to see the lower self. So when the higher self sees the lower self, then the lower self does not draw a veil over the higher self, and that's all that counts. It's no question of beating it, kicking it out of the picture, smashing it over the head, eliminating it, exterminating the lower self. We will exterminate the lower self. Obviously, that's just reflecting the aggression of the lower self back again, so then you become the lower self. So just being aware that there's the lower self. There he is. And that's all that's needed. No aggression, no fighting, no attempt to overcome. Just he's in his right place because you see him, the lower self, to be the lower self. So that is whatever you call it, the unexpected third way. The first way is to go along with the system and never even see the system as the system. The second way is to see the system as being bad and rebel against it, down with the system, and fight against the system and orientate oneself in terms of being a rebel to the system, because the system loves that. That makes the system stronger. The system thrives on that. Particularly because that allows us to project all our negativity on the system, and we become whiter than white and cleaner than clean, cleaner than the average wash, cleaner than neighbour's wash, really clean. we feel so clean because there's a bad thing out there, a bad system, a bad whatever. We can establish a relationship whereby we're saying it's bad, so we aren't bad. We're the one who's saying it's bad, etc., etc. Like people who condemn anything, really, isn't it? If we condemn bad criminals, it's not because it's just because then we can make them be the bad ones, the bad sheep, whatever it is, and we get to be whiter than white, and it's just displacement of our own personal negativity. That's all. So it's the third way is just to see the lower self, and then the lower self hasn't got any power over you. And in Gurdjieffian terms, if there is such a thing as Gurdjieffian terms, possibly there isn't, but if there is, you could say we're watching the puppets. Like Robert de Ropp says, we're watching them, we're getting to know them. There's the puppet, he's doing this thing. There's this other puppet doing that. So there's all these puppets inside us, and they're all doing this, and we watch them. We don't see them all at the same time, but first it's this puppet, then it's that puppet. Puppet personalities. Now, if we don't watch them, they become us or we become them. And then, of course, we can't watch them because we think it is us. So we become the puppet without knowing we're the puppet, which is the normal, everyday state of consciousness, to be a puppet of mechanical motivations, mechanical drives that we don't see or suspect. And act out whatever banal dramas it is that we are compelled to act out. And instead of creating a new drama where I'm struggling against the puppets, the thing is to watch the puppets and to know them, to get familiar with them, watch them. Because as long as I'm doing that, I'm not falling into the trap that I'm thinking that I'm not falling into the trap of thinking that I am a puppet, because I'm actually, I can see them. Like when there's a wasp in the room, you can see where the wasp is. That's okay. Just be aware where it is, really. You don't have to try and kill it. You could try and kill it if you want, but it's kind of maybe you could say that's a good thing to do with wasps. I don't know, particularly not if you're a Buddhist, but or someone who believes in the sanctity of life. But you definitely, when you're talking about the puppets or the interloper or the false self, it's not a good idea. Whenever we kill the self, we create a new self, as Krishnamurti says, not in those exact words. Violence against the self creates the self that is being violent to the self. Judgmentalism towards the self creates the self which is being judgmental. Feeling superior to your base or lower self just creates another self. Feeling superior to anything creates another self. Feeling inferior also creates another self. So the difficult thing is to see the interloper as an interloper, but not be driven into reacting against it or taking against it, but just stay interested and to be aware of it, take an interest in it, and study it in that way. Because the more we see and become aware of the interloper as being the interloper, the weaker it will become, and the easier it will be for us not to be fooled by it or hoodwinked by it or manipulated by it. Thanks for watching.